Welcome. It's good to have our chaplains from the armed forces here today to welcome you into our General Assembly, to hear the report and to hear from you too, and to express to you our thanks and thanks giving for all that you do in areas of life that are indeed, we know, quite difficult sometimes and challenging too. And so I call on the report for the Committee on Chaplains of Her Majesty's Forces to be given to us by Reverend Dr. Marjorie Mclean.
Moderator Marjorie Mclean, Commissioner number 525. Two questions are sometimes asked within earshot of the members of this committee. One is, what is the point of the committee? And the other is, what is the point of having military chaplains? In my written report, I have explained the legal and structural reasons for having our committee, this little piece of governance machinery, which is not needed in the same way for the other equally valuable forms of chaplaincy exercised by ministers and others. And so I won't add to that explanation here. I'd like to share why I think military chaplaincy is one of the most profoundly important things our church does. And I mean our church. Our chaplains do not leave this institution, do not go off and do their military thing and then come back again. We do not lose them for their years of service as regulars or their weeks per year of service as reservists. They are throughout as much ministers of the Kirk as I am. I could talk of the reach of the church to thousands of young, active adults who are not otherwise reached by us. I could talk of the contribution of Christian wisdom to the moral component of the most difficult and dangerous elements of national life. I could talk of the wonderful wealth of experience, skill, and understanding that chaplains bring into their later civilian ministries. But instead, I'm going to describe the single most emotionally difficult moment of my own ministry as a reservist chaplain. A dozen miles off the coast of Libya, in the heat of an August morning in 2016, I was serving for a month as the chaplain of the Navy's survey vessel HMS Enterprise in the middle of her deployment of more than a year in the migrant rescue efforts of a European Union task force. At first light each day, the spotter plane of the nearby Italian aircraft carrier would find the horribly overcrowded rubber boats that had been pushed off from the beaches in the Bay of Tripoli under cover of darkness, with only enough diesel to make it into international waters. You see, our presence was part of the smugglers' business plan. It was rescue by us or certain death. But even in the boats we rescued, not everyone survived. On that unforgettable day, with over 700 migrants eventually squeezed onto our quarterdeck, we discovered that 2 women had died, probably crushed in the lower layer of humanity crammed too deep onto one of the inadequate inflatable craft. And tragically, each of the 2 was travelling with family members who were distraught. The sister of one of these ladies was an East African woman, French-speaking and wearing a wooden cross round her neck, her only possession. Space was found for her in the makeshift first aid station under cover of a workshop near the deck to allow her to grieve. I was called for to pray with her, and I brought with me a young Catholic officer whose recent degree happened to be in French, as I knew my schoolgirl French wouldn't be up to it. We must have looked ridiculous, he and I, wearing full white paper PPE long before we all became used to it in more recent times, and kneeling on the uncomfortable hot metal deck in front of the woman as I held her hands in mine. I extemporized a prayer, with my young colleague at my shoulder translating as best he could. And then suddenly, the sorrowing figure took a breath and began to pray. Desolate, lamenting prayer, desperate, fast prayer, too fast for the young lieutenant beside me to keep up with the translation. He looked at me in panic, and I waved him away. It didn't matter to me what she was saying. She was praying now her own sorrow and need, and I only needed to keep holding her hands. That, moderator, is what these Church of Scotland ministers do. I present the report and move the deliverance.
Seconded.
Thank you, Marjorie. We have two people wishing to speak. First of all, Fiona Reynolds, number 395, and could Rosemary Hoskins please stand by to speak?
Fiona Reynolds, 395. Moderator, I'm a bit emotional. I would like to say thank you to our military chaplains, whether they are at Assembly, working elsewhere in the UK or deployed abroad. I offer my heartfelt thanks to each and every one of them. Thank you too to their families and loved ones, for operational deployments are usually often harder for those left behind than they are for the service personnel. Many thanks also to the committee for this incisive report, and particular to Dr. Mclean, who's brought me to tears in laying bare the most emotionally difficult moment of her career. Moderator, any military chaplain, serving or retired, will have similar stories to Marjorie. And the vast majority of serving personnel and veterans will tell of a time, perhaps many, when they were profoundly grateful to have a chaplain at their side. Now, I am not downplaying the key moments of ministry the rest of us experience in the parish, not indeed the hugely significant work done by prison and healthcare chaplains. But I too want to affirm the desperate need for chaplains in the armed forces, even as we face the perils of presbytery mission planning elsewhere in the Kirk. The men and women who serve in Her Majesty's forces, most of whom are under the age of 40, are children of God like you or I. They deserve to have their spiritual and pastoral needs met just as much as our own parishioners. In addition, they often need someone to represent their experiences to those in command. And for disciples of Christ, away from the structure of a congregational family, the accompaniment of a chaplain is invaluable for ongoing growth and discipleship. This is a precious, important ministry, one which everyone in the Church of Scotland should wholeheartedly support. And if any civilian minister is wondering if they might be called to military chaplaincy, I urge them to explore it. For the rest of us, including the committee and the Faith Action staff, I have something of a plea. I accept that chaplains will bring diverse skills to their future civilian ministry when so called, but I wonder if the Church might enable some of those skills and experiences to be shared with us civilian ministers a bit more sooner than that. Perhaps those of us in the parish might be enriched by hearing and learning from their experiences now. Experience because they particularly work with those under 40, who often come from very diverse backgrounds. And they do it as part of a ministry team which is almost inevitably ecumenical in its nature, all whilst navigating difficult conversations about change due to reduced resources and restructuring. I, for one, would welcome insight and wisdom on it all. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you, Fiona. Could I ask Rosemary to speak? Rosemary.
Thank you, Moderator. Rosemary Hoskins, 306. I simply wanted to give my personal thanks to each and every chaplain in HM Forces. I know from family experience how valuable your work is, and I would ask you to take my thanks and my prayers back to those you serve with. Thank you very much for all you do for us and all they do for us in very trying circumstances. Thank you. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you, Rosemary. Craig Dobney, number 375, wishes to speak.
Thank you, Moderator. Craig Dobney, number 375. Without our Forces chaplains, I'm not sure I'd be stood here today. I served... I served for 22 years in the Royal Air Force, and probably when I first joined up, I was kind of lost to God. I've been brought up in a church family, but I turned my back on God shortly after arriving in the Air Force for various reasons, and so I was that lost one. Throughout my career, my faith slowly came back, mainly because of the support and care we got from our chaplaincy teams in whichever squadron I was working with at that time. They are... I tend to describe it now. My son's in the army now, and we as parents worry about him all the time. He served in Afghanistan, he served in Iraq. But the one thing I always say is that he says, "Don't worry about me. I have my comrades, I have the guys I work with, but I also have my chaplain." And to me, or to him, the chaplain is the parent looking after those boys and girls in these conflict areas. And that's what I felt like as well throughout my career, that when my parents weren't there to support me and help me through difficult times, the chaplain was always the one that was available, whether in the station church or more likely in the squadron bar. The chaplain was always one to help out. As I went through my Air Force career and came back into God's wonderful family after being lost for so long, I just always give thanks for those chaplains who stood by me, helped me spiritually, mentally, to get through some of the difficult situations that we found ourselves in. So my heartfelt thanks go to you, and probably commiserations to my congregation that I was found again and brought to them. So thank you very much, all you chaplains of our armed forces who do such fantastic work for all of us, and the love and the kindness and support that you show to all our serving forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. John Chalmers wishes to speak, number 333.
Moderator, I really wasn't intending to speak, but just in the moment there, I rather wish this might actually be my last General Assembly, and I rather wish that this was the last speech that I ever had to make. But it's 11 years ago tomorrow, when we were leaving this General Assembly, that our son was injured. And, sorry. But what I wanted to say is that when we arrived at the hospital in Birmingham after he'd been brought back from Bastion, It was a Roman Catholic chaplain, Father Mike Sharkey, who was the person who held our hands. And today has brought it back to life. And all I wanted to say was, I'm proud of every Church of Scotland minister who serves in chaplaincy, but it's one of the places where ecumenical work within the life of the church is at its most vibrant, and it's the one place where you can be absolutely sure that nobody asks whether you're right-footed or left-footed. All that matters is that you have someone whose hand you can hold, who is somehow or another also holding the hand of God when you don't know how to be able to do that. So thank you to you all.
Thank you, John. Can we move to the deliverance? Number 1, receive the report. Number 2, again, can I just remind you that the slight delay is we're waiting for those online to approve as well. Number 3, number 4, and we want to deal with an amendment to number 5, and the amendment is in the name of the Reverend Ellen Larson Davidson, number 314. I wonder if you would speak to this amendment, please.
Yes, good morning, moderator. I also bring a teddy with us, Submariner Bear. Ellen Larson Davidson, 314. I am proposing that after the words all chaplains, that we add a comma and then the words their families, so that the deliverance would read as follows. Commend to the prayers of the church all chaplains, their families, and all those whom they serve.
Thank you. Communer, is it seconded? Thank you.
I would accept it with a comment, and that is that indeed, and I think it was mentioned already, the stress on families at a time of deployment can at times be greater than the stress on the person deployed. You know you're still alive, but they don't necessarily. And sometimes the most difficult point of all is the return, when a small person is suddenly shy in the face of a parent that they haven't seen for a long time, or your other half goes off and fixes the leaky tap and doesn't think, who's actually been perfectly adequately fixing the leaky taps for the last 6 months? And it feels like a comment. And I'm sure that Ellen will not mind me saying that she is, I think, possibly uniquely in the Church of Scotland in a situation that no chaplain's wife anywhere else has been in, which is to be the wife of a submariner, and particularly a submariner who has served in the Vanguard class submarines that carry the at-sea deterrent, because their location is always so secret that she could not know ever where Mark was, and she could not know exactly when he would return. And Dr. Brown, when she was moderator, and I were very moved by the description we had when we visited at Faz Lane of that moment when one member of one family spots the boat back home, and it's the first that they have known that it'll be back, and the social media goes red hot, and the message eventually gets all the way into the middle of Stirlingshire, and Ellen and Fraser and Sophie know that Dad was coming home. How difficult must that be? So I accept this amendment, and I go further. I apologise that I didn't have the sense I was born with to word the section that way in the first place.
we have to accept the amendment first. Does the Assembly accept the amendment? Therefore, number 5 as amended, does the Assembly accept that? Thank you. Number 6. Number 7. And the deliverance as a whole. Thank you.
Moderator, one of the members of His Grace's suite this morning is Lieutenant General Nick Borton, who is the commander of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. And from its name, you can imagine that he is probably a man under some pressure at the moment. More than one chaplain has said to me that General Nick is one of the greatest supporters of the moral and spiritual component of the services and a great friend to chaplaincy. And the committee would be very pleased if you would invite him to address the Assembly briefly. Thank you.
Is the Assembly of a mind to accept this? General Nick, is it okay to call you that? Because you've just been referred to in that way. We would be delighted if you would speak to us. Thank you.
Moderator, it's a great and daunting honour to be invited to speak to you all today. You will forgive me, therefore, if I start with a prayer of my own from another old soldier, Sir Jacob Astley, before the Battle of Edge Hill. It goes, Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I should forget thee, I pray thee, do not thou forget me. I speak to you as a soldier at a most grim and appalling time in international affairs. After generations, the shadow of major war has again fallen across Europe. And apart from the immense human tragedy it has brought, you will not be surprised to know that we in the NATO military chain are working very hard to ensure that we are as prepared as possible for the worst while doing our utmost to ensure it does not spread. But we should not be complacent. From a professional point of view, the war in Ukraine has given us another insight into the character and nature of war. Much is made of technology these days, of pilotless drones, of satellites, and cyber warfare. However, what we've seen in Ukraine has underlined an inescapable military truth, that war is still fundamentally an activity of the human heart and the human spirit. Indeed, it is the spirit of resistance and unity which has defined the extraordinary performance of the Ukrainian army and its people. It's no surprise, therefore, that the Russian forces have deliberately targeted Ukrainian churches and priests in their attempts to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. And this is an important fact for us here today. It proves what we have long recognized in the British Army and our sister services, that over and above all the paraphernalia of war, the most important thing is the human spirit and morale of your soldiers. The great World War II British commander, Field Marshal Slim, described it thus. Morale is a state of mind, an intangible force which moves a whole group of soldiers to give their last ounce to achieve something without counting the cost to themselves. The foundations are spiritual, intellectual, and physical, but spiritual first, because only spiritual foundations can stand real strain. Now, we are enormously fortunate in the Army and in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force that amongst the things that we do really well is our wonderful Royal Army Chaplains Department, who have a long and glorious history of providing pastoral care, spiritual support, and moral guidance. And it is not an easy job in this day and age. Clearly, I miss the good old days when I first joined and the jocks were marched to Kirk Parade each Sunday and the duty officer was required to read the lesson. Those compulsory days are gone now, which is probably for the best, although they didn't seem to mind it and I don't think it did them any harm. But I still believe that religion is enormously important to the soldier. Indeed, in a profession where one explicitly accepts the possibility or likelihood of one's own death, it's surprising that more soldiers would not subscribe to a faith which offered the possibility of everlasting life. The very special role of the military chaplain, or padre as we call them, as the focus for this, is beautifully illustrated in the painting by Matania of the Munster Fusiliers receiving last absolution on the eve of battle in 1915 in the trenches. Padre Gleeson sits astride his charger, ministering to his flock, a symbol of hope and courage. Padre Gleeson was a great example of the many courageous and dedicated padres we have been blessed with during all our recent conflicts in all three services. One of the most famous was Padre Studdock Kennedy, known to the troops as Woodbine Willie for the cigarettes that he distributed. Not very health and safety in the current climate, I'm afraid. He wrote a very wonderful book, which my own divisional chaplain, who is now the Chaplain General, gave me when I left the 3rd Division. Studdock Kennedy's book, which is called The Hardest Part, makes the very clear link between soldiering in a rightful cause and the Christian faith. He exhorted his flock to pray not for protection, but for courage to face the ultimate sacrifice when it came. And in this way, he saw themselves fighting the good fight in both senses simultaneously. Like the Christian spirit, good soldiers despise death and laugh at danger if they be on the route where duty lies. The Padre's duties are more varied and often more unforeseen than any other soldiers, as indeed we have already heard this morning. I had the privilege of commanding the Army's Parachute Brigade, descendants of the 1st Airborne Division, which fought so valiantly against overwhelming odds at Arnhem. All its Padres either parachuted or landed by glider into the battle. And the following account describes the role played by one Padre Thorne during the battle. Chaplain Thorne was the man on the spot, keeping everything running calmly and smoothly. His very presence created an oasis of calm amid the tumult of war. Thorne, humbly and unfailingly, cared for them in the worst hours of their lives, when they, most with appalling injuries, had greatest needs of words of peace, calm, and faith. He helped the doctor, assisted the orderlies, spoke with the wounded and bathed them as well. He dug graves, provided proper funerals, and even, without a word, calmly cleaned the latrines when he thought it necessary. Thorne was wholly prepared to give up his life for his fellow men. I'm glad to say that over my own long service, I have had the privilege of serving with many Padres of equal dedication and character as Chaplain Thorne, and who have made an immeasurable contribution to our endeavours and the lives of my soldiers. I well recall in Afghanistan being particularly worried about one of my companies who were isolated and having a hard time. Instead of a headquarters officer, I decided to send the Padre down to look after them. And he rallied them wonderfully, not only with spiritual and moral sustenance, but also with genuine leadership too. Like ammunition, commanders on operations always need more Padres. I focused on the role of Padres in operations. Of course, they also fill a vital role for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and their families in barracks as well. Now, I must say, as a Scots officer, I have mostly served with Church of Scotland chaplains throughout my career. For happily, the Army continues to try and always send Church of Scotland chaplains to Scottish battalions as a policy. And the Royal Regiment of Scotland places huge value on this link, because the jocks, as we have always called our soldiers in the Scottish regiments, find it much easier to relate to Scottish ministers, and they just seem to fit in and become part of the family that much more easily. The Church of Scotland, if I may say so, is ideally suited to the provision of chaplains, for you are very accessible, which is important for soldiers, and not overly wedded to traditionalism and doctrinalism, which is very important for an organisation that is made up almost entirely of young people. We have had some wonderful characters from the Church of Scotland over the years. One of them taught me platoon tactics as an infantry officer himself before being ordained. He remained a friend and guide throughout my career, christened my youngest daughter, and became the Chaplain General. He sits amongst you now. Another served in the Spanish Foreign Legion before joining the church and being posted to my battalion as the Padre. He remained one of the toughest soldiers in the battalion as the Padre, and he was the only one in the battalion who was parachute trained. And another, the jocks christened the Laughing Padre. Such was the volume and heartiness of his constant laughter. The jocks loved it, but we had to ban him from taking part on night patrols and ambushes. I relate these tales to reinforce how important our Church of Scotland Padres remain, whether it is serving with our regular or reserve battalions or with our cadets here in Scotland. Great challenges undoubtedly lie ahead for our forces. There will be tough times ahead, and the history of the British Army and the other two services has sadly not ended in 2022. We will have constant need of our Woodbine Willies and Padre Thorns every day, and we couldn't do without them. Moderator, I close therefore with an appropriate line which summarises it better than I ever could from the second book of Timothy. Endure hardship with us like a good soldier of Jesus Christ.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here and for that inspiring message. Was it John Duncan you were referring to?
Certainly was. Well guessed.
Might I, on behalf of the church too, say a few words of appreciation to our chaplains. I want to tell you the story of a young man who was 17 years old, quite immature, quite lost in some respects, and who had gone down to join the Navy. He ended up in a really bad place. He was so unsure about whether he was doing the right thing. He didn't know where to turn, and he eventually found his way down to the chaplain's office. Again and again and again. And it was in that office that everything was sorted for him and with him. And it was an incredible strength to him, but also to his parents, to know that he was being looked after and cared for in that situation. That's just one experience that I know of, and I'm supposed that that is replicated again and again by the people that you look after, that are out with the orbit of general society and the church. And we just want to express to you our really, really extreme gratitude for the work that you do on behalf of Christ and his kingdom as Church of Scotland chaplains. We're very much in your debt. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Dr. Marjorie Mclean. Marjorie, that was wonderful what you showed us today, and obviously something that had very much touched your hearts and touched our heart here as well. You finish your 4-year term as convener at this General Assembly, and we would like to express as an Assembly our thanks and gratitude to you. You brought to this role your own experience, not just as being somebody in the church, but in the services as well. You brought to it your intelligent, caring mind with a strong commitment to pastoral care. You did that for all 3 services, and we are indebted to you, Marjorie, for all that you've done, for the passion with which you've done it, and we would want to express to you our thanks indeed. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you. Follow the man.